Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Today's remarkable episode features a truly remarkable story of a man who grew up in a small town in Nebraska, committed a string of bank robberies, and served 11 years in federal prison, only to become a successful law graduate, appellate lawyer, arguer of cases in front of the United States Supreme Court, professor of criminal law at Georgetown Law School in Washington, D.C., and a leading advocate for criminal justice reform. It's an incredible journey, one with a lot of lessons and a perspective on what is wrong with the way we incarcerate literally more than 2 million people in our country today and what needs to be done to fix that problem. Fantastic conversation with Shon Hopwood, Professor Shon Hopwood. Stay tuned. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about criminal justice reform, a topic that is very much in the news, is very much a topic that candidates for president are talking about as they campaign across the country and debate one another. But our guest today has a very unique and remarkable perspective on that topic. Shon Hopwood, an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law School in Washington, D.C. Shon, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Shon, as I had mentioned to you when I reached out to you, I first became aware of your story watching 60 Minutes a few weeks ago, and you were profiled as the Jailhouse lawyer who not only was a enormously successful jailhouse lawyer, but then rose to some of the greatest heights in the legal profession, particularly in the world of handling appellate cases before our courts of appeals and even before the United States Supreme Court, and was so fascinated with your story that I had to see if you'd come on the podcast, and I'm grateful that you did agree to do that. We're going to be talking about a criminal justice reform and some of the ways that you think our criminal justice reform must be improved. But to do that and to understand how it is that you come to this topic with such passion, and if I can use this term, with such conviction, we have to tell the underlying story of your life. And so I want to start there. You served almost 11 years in federal prison for a series of 5 bank robberies that you were involved in when you were in your 20s. And we have to start there, Shon, and I appreciate your helping us understand that background. So tell us what happened.
Well, I was, like a lot of young men, very reckless and young and foolish, and a friend of mine came to me with the idea of robbing a bank, and what I should have said was no, or you're crazy, or anything but what I did say, which was yes. And the more we got into committing these crimes, the bigger downward spiral we were in. And, fortunately, no one was physically hurt. We scared people, and, it's something I'll regret for the rest of my life.
You were, Shon, you were a good student in high school. You were a successful student and a successful athlete as well. Is that right?
Well, I was a successful athlete.
Okay.
I was not necessarily a successful student. In fact, I don't think I once took a book home to do homework at any point when I was in school. My teachers used to tell my parents all the time that, Shon's smart, but he doesn't even try. And so I was a solid C student all the way through high school. But I did just well enough that the school wanted to give me a basketball scholarship. And it wasn't because of my academic credentials.
Mm-hmm. And this was and you grew up in a small town in Nebraska, is that right?
Yes, sprawling metropolis of 2,500 people.
Yeah. So you did well enough academically and excelled in athletics. You got a basketball scholarship to where?
Division III school called Midland Lutheran, but it didn't last very long. I was kicked out the second semester, basically for not going to class.
Mm-hmm. And what happened? I mean, were you involved in drinking? Were there drugs involved?
Wasn't, I mean, yeah, I drank like most people at the college did, but it was mostly just immaturity.
So, I mean, getting involved in the kinds of dumb stuff that kids get involved in, particularly young men, unfortunately, petty crime related to drinking or related to drugs, just dumb stuff because of immaturity, as you say, is one thing, but you found yourself involved in some pretty serious crimes. I mean, beyond sort of bad choices and the kinds of things that I think a lot of people experience. Looking back, what do you think was going on in your life at that point?
Well, it's hard to get in my head about what I was doing and why I was doing it back then. I'm now 44, married, 2 children myself, and my life's so different. It's hard for me to go back and picture and see myself doing those things. But, I tell you that I wasn't thinking at the time, and that me and my friends kind of egged each other on, and then once we got started doing it, it was one of these things that you just can't walk away from.
Yeah. Well, and of course, robbing a bank means you had money in your pockets, and I imagine that becomes sort of self-perpetuating, right?
Yeah. Well, it turns out it's really easy to spend money when you're 21 years old and you haven't earned it.
Yeah. Okay. So, and you did of course ultimately get caught, and you pled guilty, and that's going to become important later on in our conversation. The fact that you pled guilty rather than facing a trial. So you pled guilty, and
didn't really have a choice.
Well, this will be a preview of what we'll get into. But why do you say you didn't have a choice?
Well, I mean, for one, I was very guilty and just kind of wanted it to be over. But two, even if I wasn't guilty, or even if I had a triable case on some of the bank robberies, if I had gone to trial and been charged with everything they could have charged me with, instead of a 12-year, 3-month sentence, I would have received 92 years and 3 months, which in a federal system that requires 85%, that's a life sentence. And so, that's what a lot of people face as a result of the trial penalty. And so sometimes people that were unlike me, that are innocent, will oftentimes plead guilty because who wants to roll the dice and take their chances with a life sentence?
Well, and we're going to get into that and the whole issue of mandatory minimum sentences when we get to the part of our conversation where we talk about some of the reforms that I know are very important to you. But at that point, you were caught. You say you were guilty. I mean, there wasn't really much of a, as you say, a triable case. Did you think as you entered prison, federal prison, to serve your time, kind of what was your mindset at that point? Did you feel that that there was some opportunity for you? Did that shake you up in some way? Because you do go on to have a remarkable career during those 11 years in prison. I'm just curious where was your head as you entered prison?
Well, yeah, none of that happened right away. It's always astonishing to me that in the criminal justice system, there's no formalized process for the defendant to sit and think, What is it that led me to having to stand before this judge and being sentenced? And what can I do today and tomorrow to make sure that that never happens again? At no point in the criminal justice process does a defendant forced to reckon with those questions. The lawyers aren't thinking about it. The defense lawyer's thinking about acquittal or conviction, and then getting the shortest possible sentence for their client. The prosecutor's thinking about getting a conviction and the longest possible sentence. And nobody's really focused on the day after sentencing. Sometimes not even the judges. They just want to pose their punishment and go about their business, and nobody's really thinking about the day after sentencing and what happened.
Yeah, it's like they're on to the next case. Yeah, I mean,
and oftentimes, young men that get caught tend to sometimes respond just like kids that get caught, in that there's not always contrition right away, and sometimes it's defensiveness. I think those first year or two in prison, I was still the guy that robbed those banks and was still pretty foolish and reckless and immature. And the thought that I was at 22 going to have to serve over 11 years, close to 11 years in prison was just daunting. I couldn't even fathom what that would mean. And so there wasn't a lot of hope, or wasn't a lot of thought about, I'm going to go to prison and get rehabilitated. In part because in 11 years of time in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, I never once heard any staff member say the word rehabilitation.
I was just going to ask you that. Yeah, I was just going to, because we have this idea. I think if you ask most people what is the goal of putting people in prison, they would say, well, we believe in rehabilitation. We have this idea that people will go to prison, they will come out, they will have done their time, and at that point they can become fully participating members of society, citizens in our society again. But you're saying you don't even there isn't even a conversation about that.
No, and nobody was under the illusion that we were there for anything but warehousing and punishment. That was made clear by the prison system. That's made clear through the entire criminal justice system. Nobody was really concerned about rehabilitating people. And the staff didn't try to pretend that was, even part of the goal. And so what I saw were, a lot of young men that went to prison, and, the great irony of the American criminal justice system is the longer someone spends in corrections, the least likely they are to be corrected. And it's not a surprise why that is. When you take a young man and put them in an environment where every day the message either implicitly or explicitly is, you're a piece of garbage, it's only a matter of time before you get out of prison, commit a new offense, and come back. And you put someone in that sort of circumstances for decades or, at least years away from their family and community, and without many, forms of programming that could actually help that person. It's no wonder that then when people get out, we have such a high recidivism rate of people committing new crimes and going back in. When I was released in 2008 to the halfway house, I had never been on the internet, never seen an iPhone, an iPad, an iPod. One of the first things I realized when I got out of prison and was trying to find a job was that people don't advertise jobs in the classified ad section of the paper anymore.
Wow. Right.
And so there were just so many practical hurdles for people to come out of prison and have success. And, most of the men that I served time with were not guys that were saying, oh, I can't wait to get out of prison and go back to selling drugs. Most people wanted to get out and never commit a crime and never go back to prison again. But it wasn't always easy for them to overcome all those hurdles.
Yeah, I've tried many times to explain to my kids that there was a time before the cell phones that they are permanently attached to. And you're right. I mean, 10 years even is a long time. I mean, you kind of missed a big chunk of the technology revolution in our country. So, and you mentioned recidivism. without, and again, I'm sort of previewing one of the things I know we're gonna get to in a bit, but the whole issue of recidivism, that people who come out of having served a jail or prison sentence have a pretty remarkably high tendency to commit a crime again. What are those numbers? What do those numbers look like now?
Well, it depends. There's no one American criminal justice system. There's 51 criminal justice systems, and so the recidivism rate very much depends on which system. The federal system, it's around 40 to 45% of people that will come back. In some state systems, it can be as high as 75%. It also depends on how you define recidivism. Lots of people come out of prison, 650,000 people every year. But the people that get out and go back aren't always necessarily committing new crimes. Some are on supervised release, some are on probation, and sometimes it's just a technical violation that gets them sent back. Then there's the question of, do we measure recidivism by 3 years after release or 5 years? And, what I find is that correctional systems like to play with what the definition of recidivism is, and depending on what they're trying to show. But the truth is, there are way too many people coming out of prison who are ending up going back, and not all of that. I would say a majority of that is not because those people are evil. It's because they're unable to find work. They're unable to find stable housing. They have mental health issues that have not been treated in prison, and they don't get treatment when they get out. Or they have substance abuse problems, and they don't get adequate treatment for that in prison or when they get out. Not to mention, it's just difficult. Your social skills have so deteriorated when you're in prison. When I got out, I still talked like a guy that had served 11 years in prison and had been around nothing but dudes for 11 years. And you could definitely ask my wife about how difficult I was to deal with those first couple of years out of prison.
Well, and that's an important point, too, that you're mentioning, in addition to the other forms of the other kinds of challenges that people face coming out of prison. If you've served any kind of a meaningful sentence, you could also have lost contact with family, with friends, with the kind of support that could be so helpful in helping somebody get back on their feet and stay on their feet when they come out of prison.
Yes, almost every successful reentry story I've seen involved community, where someone got out and either had some friends or family or found community at a church or a synagogue, with a nonprofit. Sometimes, people get out and they go to college or junior college and they find community there, but they feel accepted and they have community when something bad happens. If you get out of prison and you've done 20 years, and over those 20 years or 10 years, all of your family and friends are gone. You've got nothing when you come out, and you're living paycheck to paycheck, and you get laid off from your job. Well, if you don't have friends or a community to fall back on, you might be put to the choice of homelessness or crime, and that's usually at the point where people will recidivate. That's why we need intervention, so that we make sure that people don't get to that point where they're forced to choose between, I can't make next month's rent, I'm going to be out on the street, or I could go down the street and go sell some drugs and make enough money to stay in this apartment. That's the choice that we want to prevent.
Shon, what can you tell us about the kinds of people you observed, that you saw, that you met during those 10, 11 years in prison? Because I think people may have a sense that we have an overcrowding problem in our state and federal prisons today, and may have an impression that the prisons are overcrowded with a lot of violent offenders, and better having them in prison than having them out on the streets. But what did you were there? I mean, what did you actually see about the population of people in prison today?
Well, there's no question that we have way too many people in prison. Every other country, especially Western country that's similarly situated to ours, uses incarceration at a much smaller rate than we do, and they're all able to keep crime down. Most people that study the system, economists, criminologists, and political scientists, say that not only was the ramp up to incarcerating 2.2 million people and mass incarceration, not only it was not the biggest driver in the crime rate going down, but at this point the system has gotten so big that it might actually be perpetuating more crime. And so there's thoughts amongst experts that we could drastically reduce the rate of imprisonment. And, several states have done that. Texas and Georgia and California have all significantly reduced their prison population in the last few years and watched crime go down at the same time. And so, what I saw in prison, well, I grew up in a fairly poor, middle-class, rural, white Nebraska. And, no one in my family had ever been to jail or prison. And, I, along with, I think, my family members, thought prison was where the evil people go. And then I got to prison and realized it wasn't evil people. It was just people that, for whatever reason, made some really bad choices. Some of them didn't have great choices to begin with. But that most of them they were not psychopaths without remorse. Most of them had the opportunity to turn around if they could just get some help. And that's kind of what I saw. Most of the people I saw in federal prison, a majority of them, had mental health issues. Many of them had substance abuse issues. And our prisons are full of people who have committed violent crimes. But, in the federal system, we also have a lot of people there for immigration offenses, nonviolent drug cases, white-collar fraud cases, and felon in possession of a firearm. And not necessarily someone who has a felony who was using the firearm to commit a crime. Sometimes the most of the people I saw were people who had felony convictions, but that merely possessed a gun. And some of them were doing 15-year mandatory minimums.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so now a lot of things kind of fell your way after a very rocky start in your life, but then a lot of things, remarkably, once you were in prison, a lot of things fell your way, and we'll talk about that. But you found yourself a mentor. You had a relationship with someone who became your wife later. I mean, you had a lot of really fantastic opportunities that came your way. But from what I know of your story, it really started with your finding your way to the law library in that federal prison. So tell us about that.
Well, my first job in prison was washing tables in the prison kitchen. Not only was it not a very fun job, but the kitchen was often one of the most dangerous places to be in the prison because they didn't watch it very carefully. There were lots of fights that happened in there. And I wanted to get out. And a friend said, "Hey, I think I can get you a job in the prison law library." And I said, "Well, I know nothing about the law. I mean, nothing." And he said, "That's all right. All you have to do is check out books." So that's what I did. And I checked out books for about 6 months. Wanted nothing to do with the law. Those books were big. They were thick. They were intimidating. When I did pull one off the shelves and read it, it felt like it was written in another language. It was not very accessible. And I didn't really think a whole lot about it until June 26th of 2000. The Supreme Court of the United States decided a case called Apprendi v. New Jersey. Everyone in federal prison thought that this case would apply to the sentencing guidelines, although very few people could tell you why. But we had all hoped for that because it might have meant a sentence reduction. And, as I often remind politicians now when on efforts like the First Step Act, where they say, we really want to rehabilitate people in prison. And I say, well, you can't just put in the program. You have to tie those two incentives. There is no better motivator for someone in prison than the thought of early release. And that was certainly the case for me. So I studied the law for several months and filed a brief in the wrong court. And then when I finally filed in the right court, Judge Cuff, the sentencing judge, quickly denied my request. And, I was never able to get any legal relief for myself, but I found that I kind of enjoyed this, solving these legal puzzles and writing out the solutions. So I started helping other people in prison write memos to their lawyers when they were on direct appeal, pointing out legal issues that I thought may have merit.
Well, Shon, let me pause on that just for a moment, because we're talking about this now like that isn't something incredibly remarkable. And for our listeners who have not been to law school, as you and I have, the idea of picking up a law book, I mean, we're not talking about a Scott Turow novel or a John Grisham novel, which may be about, some legal story. We're talking about case books where decisions and opinions from judges in varying real cases get gathered together in very thick volumes. And then when a lawyer or even a non-lawyer such as yourself at this point in time wants to look up and cite to a prior case as a precedent, as offering some basis for what you're trying to accomplish in your own case, you can refer back to that. But to read a law book, I mean, as I understand it, you were, after you got through first few months of sort of checking out books for others or helping others get access to books, you yourself started just reading these case reporters filled with decisions from cases all over the country. I mean, that's pretty
pretty
is
incredible. So bizarre because, anyone that knew me prior to this, if you'd have told them that Shon would read federal reporters for kicks, they'd have said, what? Shon will not be reading judicial opinions ever, let alone just for fun. But the law fascinated me, and, I just dove in head first. But it was very difficult because, there's a reason why in first-year law school we don't start off teaching lawyers habeas law. Not a very good way to try to learn the law from the ground up is through the law of habeas corpus, which is one of the most technical, one of the most difficult areas of law, and one of which that lawyers screw up all the time in federal and state courts. And so it was pretty daunting, but I just found that I really enjoyed it. And then, I don't know what would have happened had the first few years all I had done was file briefs that were rejected. But fortunately for me, early on I had some success, and that kind of propelled me forward.
Mm-hmm. And by success, what does that mean exactly? Another prisoner would come to you and ask for help, and
and I would write, memos, but that wasn't really success because, as you can imagine you're a lawyer who has 10 years of experience, and you went to, a top 50 law school, and you've got a case on direct appeal in the federal circuit courts, and some guy who has not even taken freshman English from prison, who's friends with your client, sends you a memo saying, hey, I think these issues have potential merit. How do you think most lawyers viewed my letters to them?
Right.
Well, it wasn't very good, and actually I ended up having to testify against one several years later on an ineffective assistance of appellate counsel claim when I basically testified in favor of a criminal defendant. We had sent the lawyer the winning issue, and the lawyer rejected it out of hand because, it was sent to him by me. And so, that wasn't successful. But once I started writing briefs, I wrote a habeas petition. And then either the second or the third legal brief I prepared was for a man named John Sellers, who was a friend of mine, came to me and said, I went to trial, was convicted. He was convicted of a methamphetamine conspiracy. And he comes to me and says the Eighth Circuit just denied my appeal, and my lawyer says I have no chance of getting my case heard in the Supreme Court. But he said, I want to file anyway, and will you do it for me? And I told John, absolutely not. I said, I didn't know a great deal about the Supreme Court, but I knew the odds were so against us. The court receives 7,000 to 8,000 petitions for writs of certiorari a year. They grant around 70 to 80 of those. That means you got a 1% chance, but that 1% chance is for lawyers filing briefs in the Supreme Court, not indigent federal prisoners. And so, not to mention that I just knew that, filing a habeas motion in federal district court is not the same as filing a cert petition to the Supreme Court.
And just in a sentence, Shon, for those who don't know, a habeas petition means what?
Just a post-conviction motion. Usually happens after someone's direct appeal, where they are arguing that mistakes were made in their conviction and sentence, and most of them are raising ineffective assistance to counsel and saying that their lawyers made mistakes and that those mistakes either led to them being convicted when they shouldn't have been, or led, and a lot of what I did was not trial ineffective assistance. A lot of what I did was sentencing ineffective assistance, where lawyers had made mistakes at sentencing, and it really cost their clients sometimes a decade or two in extra time in federal prison. And so I did, started writing those, and is filed one or two.
Is that what the issue was in John Sellers' case when he came to you and asked you to
It
help
wasn't.
him?
So John was on direct appeal, and what John had was a case where he had been indicted, and so his Sixth Amendment right to counsel kicked in. But when the police came to arrest him, they got him started talking without giving him Miranda warnings, and he makes an inculpatory statement, and then they arrest him. They drive him 20 minutes to the jail, and this time they give him a Miranda waiver form, which he signs, and they ask him the same questions that they had asked him back at his house. And because he had already made an inculpatory statement once, he didn't realize that they couldn't use that, and so he goes on and makes more inculpatory statements, and those were all presented at the trial. And so the question was whether the first statements violated John's Sixth Amendment rights to counsel, because the government deliberately elicited statements from him without giving him Miranda. And then the second question was, assuming there's a Sixth Amendment violation, does the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine apply to the second set of statements? It was, in other words, it was a very complex issue of criminal procedure. It's one that I now teach to law school students at Georgetown, and students routinely make mistakes because there's also the Fifth Amendment, and there's Miranda, and then the Sixth Amendment right to counsel that includes Miranda. And it was not an easy case to figure out what the problems were. And, I just spent months on it, and eventually pecked out a brief on a prison typewriter, and we filed it, and I largely forgot about John in this case. He transferred to another prison, and, I had no idea what would happen.
So against all those really just incredible odds, and adding to the odds that most of us lawyers who've ever tried to get a case into the Supreme Court, you add to that you're not even at this point a college graduate, let alone a law school graduate. You're not writing on a laptop computer and sending it off to a professional publisher so that it looks all nice and pretty when they get it at the Supreme Court. You're typing this on a prison typewriter, and then you get news that the Supreme Court actually is going to accept the appeal.
Yes, I was on my way to the recreation yard one morning. A friend came running and screaming out of the housing unit, and he had a copy of the USA Today in his hand, and it said that the court had granted John Sellers' case. It said how unlikely that was, given John had filed without a lawyer. And it even quoted a couple of those sentences that I had pecked out on that prison typewriter. And, it was a joyous moment, one of the few good moments in prison. And I think I understood how significant it was. I would never have guessed that this would lead me to continuing with the life of the law and getting out and going to law school and becoming a lawyer, and certainly not a professor at Georgetown. But I did know that it was a big deal because of one quick and immediate thing. I became very, very popular in federal prison.
Right.
There were not many days I could walk across the compound where people weren't stopping me to say, "Hey, Shon, can I get 5 minutes of your time? I just want to tell you about my case." And if you look at the mail I receive at Georgetown, in some respects, things haven't changed much because I get a lot of mail from people in prison and from family members who have people in prison saying, "Hey, Shon, will you just read my letter and take a look at my case?"
You know, Shon, I mean, I'm a trial lawyer, Shon. I remember very well the feeling of winning my first big case and thinking, wow, I can do this. I actually can do this. And it's so validating and so encouraging and inspiring. Again, to hear, when you trace your life up to that moment, when someone runs up to you with that USA Today article, that must have been a real turning point, I would have to think, in terms of how you thought of yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, it was life-changing in that how I thought of myself, but it was life-changing in that I was able to use skills that I learned on my own to help someone. And people ask, what was your personal rehabilitation like, and how did that happen? And I often say, well, a lot of it was just growing up, gaining some wisdom, and getting out of the foolishness and recklessness. But a lot of it, too, was helping people and not focusing on myself and trying to help other people in the prison. And that really changed me. When you're in that environment where, again, you're told you're worthless, to then get a Supreme Court to grant your case, then the lawyer that takes over the case is Seth Waxman, who's the former Solicitor General of the United States and the head of the appellate and Supreme Court practice at Hale.
Big law firm in D.C., yeah.
Yeah, and when someone who has argued 80-some cases in the Supreme Court is on the phone with you saying, "You did a really good job on this cert petition. I would be proud if one of my associates had filed this." That had an impact.
Wow. How did you get Seth Waxman to take? Obviously, you couldn't yourself appear before the Supreme Court.
Well,
you had
like I became popular.
Yeah.
John Fellers became popular.
Mm.
There were, let's just say, there were lots of lawyers from Washington D.C. calling his prison, offering their services.
Wow.
Because they all wanted to argue the case, because that's a pinnacle for appellate lawyers. But John didn't say yes to any of them, and John realized maybe I want the ones that aren't calling. And he had talked to a federal defender who said, "You should really give Seth Waxman a call." And he does. And Seth agrees to take the case, but with one contingency. Seth finds out that it wasn't John that wrote the petition, it was me, and he tells John, "Well, I'll take the case, but I want to keep Shon Hopwood involved. How do I get in contact with him?"
Incredible.
I think most people in Seth's circumstances, Harvard undergrad, Yale Law School, rose federal clerkships, rose to the ranks of DOJ, becomes the top appellate lawyer in the U.S. government. I think most people like that would say, "Hey, Mr. Uneducated Jailhouse Lawyer, great job getting the case heard, but we'll take it from here." And yet Seth, for I don't know what reasons, kept me a part of the team. They would send in drafts of the merits briefs. I would write notes on them, put yellow sticky notes on them, and send them back out. We had a conference call one day with Seth and 3 other lawyers a week before oral argument. And they're asking me, the guy who had been self-learning the law for 18 months, "Hey, Shon, what do you think Justice O'Connor will ask at oral argument that we haven't thought of?" And, my response was, "I have no idea." Again, to have a mentor and someone like that telling you good job, and that who treats you not like you're a convicted felon spending time in federal prison, but as a colleague and a human being, that had a huge impact on my life.
Well, he had to have been very impressed with what you had accomplished already, but what he did for you, I mean, really showing you respect and treating
Yeah.
you like someone deserving of respect. I mean, that I imagine that had to be pretty powerful in shaping your own sense of your potential and validating what you had been working hard to try to be in a position to do in terms of helping other people and helping yourself.
It was. And, the lawyers at Wilmer Hale, there was another lawyer named Noah Levine, who's now a partner in their New York firm. Not only did they, help me and kept me involved with the Feller's case, but I think I talked with Noah Levine every month for the last 5 years I was in prison. And, to have someone that I could ask questions to, and they would just do all sorts of neat little things for me. One of the things that Noah did when I asked him was, hey, I don't have anyone that can teach me how to write briefs. I kind of learn by seeing how other people do it. He sent me a box of Wilmer Hale Supreme Court briefs. And so, I kind of learned from Wilmer Hale by reading their briefs and then eventually briefs by other really good lawyers about how to do appellate practice and how to write these briefs in a way that judges will be persuaded by.
Mm-hmm. Incredible. So they not only made you a part of the team in the Sellers case, but they stayed a part of your life and really took you under their wing to mentor you and to help you, in a sense, help you get through the rest of your sentence.
Yeah, and then, things just kind of exploded. I started reading as much law as I could. One of the weird things about learning the law just through books, because we did not have Westlaw or Lexis, is that, shepherdizing is not an exact science. And so it would take me a lot longer to research issues than normal people. And I would sometimes have to read 20 cases to find the one case that cites to what I need, which is not a very efficient way of learning the law. But for somebody who's trying to just be a sponge, I ended up reading like 4,000 judicial opinions while in prison.
But Shon, I'm
benefits me just to this day.
Yeah, but I'm old-fashioned. I'm old enough that I learned how to shepherdize in law school. And for those again who aren't lawyers and don't know what that means, if you want to cite a case in support of some principle or some proposition in your argument, you have to make sure that case is still good law, that it hasn't been overturned by a later court decision. Yep. And that whole process, for sort of like, we talk about the card catalog at the library, which I'm sure most people of a certain age today don't know what that means either. But there is something about the process, I think, of learning it the hard way. Another example I often think of is, we all now, you didn't know this while you were in prison, but when you came out at some point, you came to realize that we now look at our phones to tell us where we're supposed to be going. But all it tells you is turn right up here, go a mile, turn left there. It doesn't even really give you a sense of where you actually are. In other words, it doesn't give you the context and perspective that a map would give you, this old-fashioned thing we call a map. And so, yeah. I think, isn't there something about having had to do it the hard way, the way you did, the way you had to learn, had to be, I would think, tremendous value in doing it the way you did it.
Yeah, and I think that I read the book, Malcolm Gladwell book, Outliers, and one of the arguments he makes in that book is 10,000 hours of doing something is like a goalpost that really helps people become very good at what they're doing, and that's about what I had in prison was 10,000 hours of reading and doing litigation. I ended up winning another case in the Supreme Court. We won the Feller's case 9-0. I won a case in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and by the time I had left, I had won cases in several district courts across the country.
Well, I promised we'd save time for for some of the broader lessons that you've learned from this experience and some of the issues that you speak about now and that you teach your students at Georgetown about. I mean, but we can kind of, not meaning to minimize the accomplishments that came later, but you got out of prison, you got a job, you were able to get a job, again, thanks to a recommendation from your Wilmer Hale mentors. And then you got into law school at the University of Washington, which, by the way, in itself is remarkable. I mean, a convicted felon actually being admitted to a law school is no small achievement either. And then got a job as a federal clerk, a clerk to a federal judge, Janice Rogers Brown at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Appeals Court in the District of Columbia, which most of us lawyers recognize as the second most important court in the whole country. I mean, these are fantastic achievements for somebody, who came from the background that you would come from.
Yeah, well, if you saw me walk to the law school, you would see what I see, which I walk every day down from Union Station, about 3 blocks to Georgetown University Law Center. And I cross New Jersey and I look, and there 3 blocks away is the Capitol building. And then I cross First Street, and this is usually when I start laughing, and I look down, and a block and a half from my office is the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And what you'd see if you saw me walking up to the law school to go teach is just me smiling or chuckling. Because honestly, in most circumstances, I just shouldn't be here. I had lots of lawyers. I mean, my goal when I got out of prison was to be a paralegal and work for lawyers, because I had, several hundred lawyers tell me, Shon, I don't care what success you've had, no law school is going to accept you. Even if you're lucky enough to get in a law school, no bar association is ever going to let you practice law. And fortunately for me, between my wife and Seth Waxman, they encouraged me to go to law school. And then what I found was that all these lawyers that told me it couldn't be done were wrong, and that it wasn't going to be easy. But, I was just very, very stubborn for my success. And because of that, I didn't listen to the naysayers.
Well, and you worked hard too. I mean, and I think that's a lesson that's lost on a lot of people too, right? I mean, we shouldn't.
But here's what I would say about that. I would say I could have been the smartest, hardest working person on the planet, neither of which is true. And none of that would have mattered had people like Seth Waxman not gone out of their way to help me. And so that's my story. My story is the people that have helped me along the way. They've helped me overcome these hurdles. I did my part, but, that would not have been enough.
Well, and I think, Shon, that's a great segue into some of the issues that we've touched on so far, but I want to hear more about from you, because so many other people who may very well have the brains, may very well have all kinds of talents and abilities and good intentions after they have found, after they've been sentenced and are now in prison, don't have the kind of support and opportunities that you had, thanks to some of the people who believed in you and stepped up to support you in your life. What are the lessons from that experience? Your hard work, yes, but also good fortune as well. What does that teach you? And in turn, how do you then teach your students about what needs to change in the way that we handle crime and punishment today?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I do is I always make the case and say, even if the system we have now was keeping crime down, and even if it was working, I would still say it's unjust to have 2.2 million people in prison and punishing people to the point where we cripple them for life, and then we tend to think that once someone has served their time, they get out, they get a second chance. But that's not true either. there are hundreds of thousands of collateral consequences in a felony conviction. People can be legally discriminated against in housing, employment, public benefit, sometimes voting rights. And, it impacts my felony conviction, even as a white male Georgetown Law professor, still impacts my life pretty frequently. And so people don't get a second chance. And, as someone who studies the criminal justice system, I just think we can do it much, much better, have more justice, and get at some of the root causes. Because sending someone to prison for a long term does not get at the root causes of why they ended up committing a crime and why they're in prison. And again, if we were to take a bunch of kids who misbehaved out of their community, away from their parents, and isolated them and put them in a facility where they're just around nothing but other similarly situated kids, we would say that would be a disaster. Well, it turns out the same thing happens with adults. And it's just not effective, and it's just not fair to lock people up for as long as we do for some of the things that they have done.
Well, I want to ask
you. That's not to say that,
yeah.
We shouldn't have incapacitation. We shouldn't lock up people that are truly dangerous. But we generally don't need to lock them up for nearly as long as we do. All the social science tells us that people tend to age out of crime, especially violent crime. I often introduce myself in this manner. I've introduced myself to senators, federal judges, to the president, and I do it at lots of speaking events. And what I say is, my name is Shon Hopwood. I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and I committed a violent crime, but I am not a violent criminal.
Mm. Well, I have to ask you about two specific areas before I've exhausted your patience and your time today. One of them is this whole issue of sentencing, but let me ask you that second. First, I want to come back to something we touched on early on, which is something that all first-year law students who take a first-year law school class in criminal law hopefully talk about it. I know we talked about it with my criminal law professor in law school, which is really the foundational principle behind punishment of crime. And, there's this sort of theoretical debate as to why and how we punish people. Is it to rehabilitate? Is it rehabilitation? We have a defunct prison here in Philadelphia called Eastern State Penitentiary that I think was one of the first prisons that actually was founded on the idea that its inmates could be rehabilitated. And it's a fascinating place. If anybody comes to Philadelphia as a visitor, you should make a point to go there. They have a great tour and to talk about this. But there is also this idea in the thinking about and the philosophy of criminal law that we have a retributive basis for crime and for punishment of crime. That is, someone deserves to be punished if they did a bad thing, and that's why they're in prison. I mean, what do you think about that? Because you've talked about the fact that you go in to serve a sentence in federal prison, and nobody's even really talking about what rehabilitation even means or looks like, or what kinds of things we should be talking about with people.
Yeah, there has been a renewed focus on rehabilitation the last few years, but through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, rehabilitation kind of fell out of favor. And people thought that you just can't rehabilitate people. And I'm definitely an illustration of why that's not true. We tend to think we can figure out at sentencing, and we ask judges to do the impossible, which is try and determine who has the ability to turn it around and who doesn't. When I was sentenced, I told Judge Cuff that he would never see me again, that I would change. And that Judge Cuff, what he said was that Hopwood was all punk, all mouth, nothing else. And when he said those words, I'd have bet all the farm and all the animals that he would never make a productive citizen. And he said, shortly after I got my clerkship with Judge Brown, he said, what Shon's shown me is that my sentencing instincts, and these are his words, not mine, my sentencing instincts suck. And what I told Judge Cuff, we're now friends. I just saw him with my wife and kids last month.
That's incredible.
Pictures in the courtroom where he sentenced me.
Wow.
And what I said was, your sentencing instincts don't suck. We just can't tell who has the power to turn it around. And in part because we don't really focus on that in prison. And, that's not a system that helps crime victims. When people go to prison and do long terms and get worse off, not better, and then they get out and create new victims. And I spent a lot of time talking to victims of crime, and a lot of them, don't want to see people go to prison for a long time. What they want is they want to hear from the defendant why the defendant committed a crime against them, and they want to hear contrition, and they want to hear, well, how are you going to fix the harm? If you have had money stolen from you, sending someone to prison for 5 years is not going to bring the money back. It's not going to fix the harm that person did on you. And so I think we have to think more about how do we fix the harms of crimes, and how do we hold people accountable without putting them in prison and crippling them for life. Especially when you think about the social costs. Many of the people I was in prison with have wives and kids, and when they go to prison, those families go on welfare and other social programs, and we know that when kids have one of their parents incarcerated, that child is at higher risk for behavioral issues, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and a much higher risk of going to prison themselves. And so trying to incarcerate our way out of this problem is just not going to work.
And if rehabilitation isn't really pursued actively with support, education, counseling, training, post-release support services as well, and we know of a high recidivism rate, as you mentioned earlier, we're just spending a whole lot of money keeping people in prison, paying for them to come back to prison if they do commit a subsequent. I mean, there's a lot of costs involved in the way things are being done currently. If the priorities were shifted, just seems like you'd save so much in so many of the ways that we're paying for the current system.
Politically, it's really difficult because what most Americans will say is, well, why would you give free job training to those people? They broke the rules. They broke the law. I am a citizen who followed the rules. I'm not getting that. And so politically, it's really hard to do that, even though it's so short-sighted when you realize that, 650,000 people are coming out of prison to come back to be our neighbors and in our communities every year. And, what worries me is oftentimes the people that commit the worst crimes, we're not giving them anything in the way of rehabilitation, and we're not giving them the incentive of early release to rehabilitate themselves because we don't want to see them get out of prison one day early. I had a very good conversation with the former Attorney General Jeff Sessions about this very thing when I said, I don't know why you would want to exclude people who commit sex offenses from rehabilitation programs and the incentive of early release. I said it worries me that we're warehousing people that committed sex offenses for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, not trying to help them, and then you're going to kick them out to be my neighbor around my kids. That does not seem like a good solution to the problem.
Yeah. Well, the other political issue, because it is politicians ultimately who pass laws in Congress or in state legislatures, is this competition to be tough on crime. And tough on crime, it seems, has been equated with long prison sentences. And that brings me to the second big issue that I know is very important to you and have talked about, and was a big part of the focus of your appellate practice when you were still in prison, which is the whole issue of sentencing and how people are being sentenced. I was visiting with my parents a couple weeks ago. My mother was telling the story of a time she served on a jury in California. This was a number of years ago. and it was a criminal defendant who was involved in very, very low-level, nonviolent dealing of marijuana. But it was the third offense. And as part of the so-called war on drugs, in California, they passed a three strikes you're out rule. And when there was no question he was guilty, and the jury and the judge had no flexibility in the sentence because it was a third offense. He ended up with a very, very long sentence. What is the problem from what you've seen? And you, again, of course, you've seen it from the inside, and you've seen it as an appellate lawyer, and now as a professor who teaches criminal law at a very prestigious law school. What is the problem that you see with mandatory minimum sentences, and what do you think ought to be done about it?
Well, I mean, the problem with sentencing is we generally want the person that is conflict-free and the person that does this for a living and the person that has the most information to make the decision on sentencing. But with mandatory minimums, that's all flipped on its head because the person then making the decision at sentencing is not the judge. It's the prosecutor by how the prosecutor charges the case that can really tie the judge's hands. And so what happens is, a prosecutor sees a criminal defendant a few times in court and makes up their mind and files charges or gets a guilty plea to a bunch of crimes carrying mandatory minimums. And, even if there are mitigating circumstances, the judge's hands are tied. The judge, on the other hand, especially a federal judge, has Article 3 life tenure. And so that's the person that has the least amount of conflict in sentencing. And the judges also do this for a living, and they receive a pre-sentence investigation report. They get briefing from both sides. So why wouldn't we want the judges having the power to sentence rather than prosecutors? And the other reason mandatory minimums are so bad is because of the trial penalty. One of the things the First Step Act fixed was one of the worst federal statutes, which says that if you use a firearm during a crime of violence or a drug trafficking crime, it's 5 years consecutive to whatever other crimes you're charged with for the first offense and 25 years for every offense after that. And so I know a whole bunch of people in federal prison that are serving really long. One case I'm filing on here soon is a friend of mine, Adam Clausen, whose case was virtually identical to mine. 9 robberies of massage parlors around Philadelphia. No one physically hurt, but the difference was I pled guilty and Adam went to trial. And I got 12 years, 3 months, and Adam got a 213-year prison sentence because of the mandatory minimums the prosecutor had charged.
And again, that's because there was a gun involved, even though, he didn't fire
robbery.
the gun. Yeah, he didn't fire the gun, and nobody was actually hurt, but because he was in possession of a gun in connection with those crimes, that added hugely to the amount of time he got.
And so the 213-year sentence has nothing to do with the culpability of Adam Clausen. His culpability, and it really has nothing to do with the crime. And it has all to do with the fact that he had the gall to exercise his constitutional right to a jury trial. And because of that, the Department of Justice, got a life sentence for him.
Well, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Shon, but how would that have, tell us again how that would have played out in your case if either
I would have gotten a 92-year and 3-month sentence had I gone to trial and lost. The 92 years, I probably would have had to serve, about 85 of them.
No, we wouldn't be having this conversation for sure.
Yeah, society would be paying to keep me in prison, like they are Adam Clausen, who, by the way, has, assembled one of the most remarkable records of rehabilitation in the federal prison system. People would have been paying to keep me there for life, even though there's no question that, people that are in their 20s that commit violent crimes, by the time they're in their 40s, they have aged out of that, and they are not a large risk of recidivism. That is, unless we keep them in prison for so long that they're never able to get back out into society and adjust.
Mm. Well, I mean, given the politics of these issues, I mean, and you're talking to people at pretty high levels. I mean, you're talking to the former Attorney General and members of Congress and all. I mean, realistically, and we're about to enter an even more intense phase of a political season, if we're not already there. What do you think realistically, given the politics, are the best prospects for addressing this issue of mandatory minimums?
I don't know. I think it's we won't see anything on the federal side till after the 2020 election.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the people are those 2.2 million people in prison or in state prisons, and so more states have come to the realization that it's really costly to do law and crime and punishment this way, and that it doesn't make sense. But I think that we just have to, as the reform community, we have to convince more Americans that there is a prison problem, and that the prison problem is making things worse, not better. And I feel like if we can make that case to more Americans, we'll get more politicians that feel comfortable voting for this. Most of the politicians I speak to know that this is the right answer. But they're not going to vote for something if they think it's going to lead to them getting voted out of office as a result. So, you got to build political support and political cover for politicians to vote for the best policy views. And we have work to do. We're doing a pretty good job on the coast, but we have everything in between those two, where we still have, as a reform community, to make our case to people in the Midwest and the South and parts of the West, and convince them that you can't claim we are the land of liberty on one hand, and on the other know that we incarcerate people at a greater rate than almost any other country on the planet.
Well, Shon Hopwood, I really appreciate you coming on our podcast. Shon, an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law School in Washington, D.C., where he teaches criminal law, civil rights, and constitutional rights of prisoners, and obviously someone with a unique and enormously compelling perspective on our system of crime and punishment in this country. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you, Shon. I really appreciate it very much.
All right. Well, thank you, and thanks for having me.